only to have the HOA build a fence around your entire ranch, trapping you in like a prisoner. But instead of giving in, this man pulled off the ultimate twist. He ended up owning the only way out, leaving the HOA stunned. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Click, click, click. That was the sound of the posts going into the ground. At first, James didn't pay much attention. He was a quiet man, the kind who preferred the company of his cattle and the wide-open sky over neighborhood politics. Life on his ranch had always been simple. Early mornings with coffee, long days of tending animals, and evenings spent watching the sun sink behind the hills. But that morning, as he stepped out onto his porch with his steaming mug, something didn't sit right. Across the edge of his property, men were working. They hammered, measured, and hoisted wooden posts into the dirt with a steady rhythm. James narrowed his eyes. A fence was going up. At first, he thought maybe the workers were just fixing a boundary line or building something temporary for a neighbor. But as the hours passed, the line of posts kept stretching, longer, wider, and closer, until James realized with a sinking feeling that the fence wasn't just along one border. It was wrapping around his entire ranch. Confused and angry, James strode over to the crew. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked. The workers, sweating in the sun, didn't look particularly concerned. One of them shrugged and handed him a packet of papers. "It's from a HOA," the man said flatly. "We're just following orders." James flipped through the documents. According to the Homeowners Association, his driveway, which had existed long before the neighborhood expanded, crossed what they called shared land. Because of that, they claimed they had the authority to fence it off and regulate access. But as James scanned the blueprint, his heart pounded harder. This wasn't just about the driveway. The fence on the plans completely surrounded his property. Every acre of his ranch, every pasture and barn, was boxed in by the HOA's design. The only way out was through a locked gate, one that the HOA would control. For a moment, James just stood there stunned. He felt his throat tighten as the reality sank in. His land, his family's land that he had worked for years to maintain, was being caged in as though it belonged to someone else. The cattle grazing peacefully in the distance had no idea their world was shrinking, but James did. "Are you telling me I can't even drive off my own land without going through your gate?" he demanded. The worker gave another shrug. "That's the arrangement. Take it up with the board." James clenched his fists. He had never been a man who enjoyed conflict, but this was different. This was his livelihood. Ranching wasn't just a job. It was survival. Without free access to the roads, he couldn't transport cattle, haul supplies, or even leave in an emergency. Imagine owning acres of beautiful land, yet feeling like a prisoner inside your own fence line. That was the reality James now faced. Neighbors began to whisper. Some felt sorry for him. Others sided with the HOA, believing the rules were for the good of the community. But James knew what it really was: control. The HOA had overstepped, and he was the one paying the price. At night, James couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with maps spread out in front of him, tracing every corner of his property. His father had once told him, "Land is freedom. Never let anyone take that from you." And now, freedom was exactly what the HOA threatened to steal. Days passed, and the fence grew taller, stronger, more permanent. Each post hammered into the ground felt like a nail in his independence. The sight of the padlocked gate at the end of his driveway made his stomach twist. He had spent his life living on his own terms, but suddenly, he needed permission just to leave his own home. James tried calling the HOA board, but every conversation ended in the same rehearsed phrases: community rules, shared land, proper authority. No one listened to the fact that he had been there long before the HOA even existed. No one cared that their fence had turned a man's ranch into a cage. He walked the length of the new fence line one evening as the sun set. His boots crunched against the dirt, and his dog trotted at his side. He felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The wide horizon had always given him a sense of peace, but now it felt like a cruel joke. Freedom stretched endlessly beyond the fence, and yet he couldn't reach it. The sound of cattle lowing in the pasture reminded him of what was at stake. His animals needed him to fight. His land deserved better. James wasn't going to let himself be fenced in without a battle. And so he began to plan. He started digging into property records, searching through old deeds, and talking to lawyers who understood land rights. If the HOA thought they could quietly trap him inside his own ranch, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Because James wasn't just a rancher. He was a man rooted in the soil, bound to his land by history, sweat, and pride. And when you try to cage a man like that, you don't break him, you awaken something far stronger. The fence may have been built, but the fight for freedom was only just beginning. At first, James tried to reason with them. He walked into the HOA office with a folder tucked under his arm, every document neatly prepared. The paper showed in black and white that he had full rights to his driveway, that the so-called shared land was actually part of an easement he had held since the property was first developed. He laid it all out on the boardroom table, speaking calmly, hoping reason would prevail. But the board members barely looked up from their papers. A few exchanged smug glances. One leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. James, we're not disputing your ownership. We're enforcing community order. If you want access through the gate, you'll simply need to pay the association's special access fees." James blinked. "Fees? For my own driveway? That's the policy." Another board member replied without hesitation. "You'll need to pay annually. Otherwise, you'll remain gated." The amount they demanded was ridiculous. Thousands of dollars a year. Money with no clear explanation of where it went. No justification beyond their so-called rules. It wasn't about order. It was about control. James's jaw tightened. He wasn't the type to pick fights, but he also wasn't about to be bullied on his own land. Not now. Not ever. So he fought back the only way he knew how, methodically. He spoke with lawyers, gathering every legal angle he could. He filed formal complaints with the county, bringing attention to the HOA's overreach. He even went door to door, speaking with neighbors, collecting signatures from those who agreed the HOA had gone too far this time. Some neighbors were sympathetic. They signed without hesitation, disgusted by the board's abuse of power. Others were afraid of retaliation, afraid of fines, rules, and threats. The HOA had a reputation for being ruthless, and many didn't want to get caught in its crosshairs. Still, James pushed forward. Weeks went by. Letters were sent. Hearings were requested. Yet the board stood firm. They were stubborn, confident, and perhaps a little too sure of themselves. No matter what James presented, the answer was the same. The fence stays. The gate stays. And unless he paid their ridiculous fees, James's ranch would remain a cage. It was humiliating, driving up to that gate every morning, fumbling with a lock that technically wasn't even his, waiting for permission on his own land. It burned him up inside. His ranch, which had once been a symbol of freedom, now felt like a prison yard. But what the HOA didn't know was that James was patient. And James was smart. He wasn't going to lash out in anger. He wasn't going to waste energy shouting at people who thrived on power. No, James played the long game. Late at night, when the rest of the neighborhood slept, James sat at his desk under the dim glow of a lamp. He pored over property maps, old county records, and land surveys. He traced every border of his ranch with a steady finger, paying special attention to the strip of land where the HOA's precious gate now stood. That strip, narrow, seemingly insignificant, wasn't just community land. James noticed something in the old records. The HOA didn't own it outright. In fact, the legal description of the property line was vague, outdated, and poorly maintained. Digging deeper, James discovered a loophole, one that no one on the HOA board seemed to have noticed. He realized that with the right filings, the right purchase, or even a quiet claim, he could secure control over that very strip of land. The land where the only gate stood. The land that every other homeowner in the HOA needed to access the outside world. And that's when it hit him. The HOA thought they had boxed him in, but in reality, they had built their entire fence and their entire plan on a single weak point. If James could claim that strip, then the gate, the fence, and even the HOA itself would fall into his control. It was almost poetic. They had tried to trap him, but they had unknowingly handed him the key to their own freedom. James leaned back in his chair that night, a slow smile spreading across his face. He wasn't beaten. Far from it. The board thought they had won, but James had something they didn't: patience, determination, and the will to fight for what was his. The fence may have made his ranch look like a cage, but soon that cage would swing open, not because the HOA allowed it, but because James had outsmarted them at their own game. The tables were about to turn. After months of digging through property records, James finally stumbled on something that made his heart stop. That little strip of land with the gate, the very piece of ground that determined his freedom, didn't actually belong to the HOA. For all their bluster, all their threats, and all their arrogance, the board didn't even own it outright. They only leased it from a private owner who lived out of state. James rubbed his eyes, reading the record again and again just to be sure. There it was in plain ink. The land under the gate, the only entrance and exit to the entire neighborhood, belonged to someone completely outside the HOA's reach. For the first time in months, James felt hope. He knew this was his chance. Instead of endlessly battling the HOA in hearings and lawsuits that seemed to go nowhere, he could go around them entirely. So he tracked down the contact information for the true owner, a man who had inherited the land years ago, but hadn't set foot there in decades. To him, it was nothing more than a small, overlooked parcel on the edge of a map. James picked up the phone. He explained everything: how the HOA had built a fence that cut him off from the world, how they were abusing their authority, and how all of it hinged on that single strip of land. The man on the other end listened quietly. Then, with a light chuckle, he said, "Sounds like they've been using it for free publicity more than anything else. Make me a fair offer, and it's yours." James didn't hesitate. He made the offer then and there, an amount that was generous but still a fraction of what the HOA had demanded in fees. Within weeks, the paperwork was signed, sealed, and finalized. James now legally owned the land where the gate sat. Yes, you heard that right. The HOA had fenced him in, thinking they had absolute control. But with one smart move, James had flipped the script. The gate wasn't theirs anymore. It was his. When word reached the HOA board, the reaction was priceless. At first, they didn't believe it. They insisted James was bluffing. They even tried to send their lawyer after him, demanding proof. James simply slid the freshly signed deed across the table at the next meeting. The room went silent. One board member's face turned red. Another stammered, trying to piece together a counterargument. But the truth was undeniable. James was the only person with legal rights to the gate, which meant every single resident in that neighborhood, every homeowner who had relied on that road, now depended on him to get in and out. It was poetic justice. The same HOA that had tried to cage him in was now caged themselves. Without James's cooperation, they couldn't use their own fence. Their entire power play had backfired spectacularly. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now came knocking on James's door, suddenly eager to be friendly. Some apologized for not standing by him earlier. Others nervously asked if he planned to block their access. James listened patiently, but he never gloated. He wasn't interested in revenge, just fairness. So he laid out his rules. "I won't shut anyone out," he told them. "The road stays open. But from now on, there will be no more HOA games. No more fences boxing people in. If you want access, it'll be under simple, reasonable terms, and no one will ever be trapped the way I was." It was a masterstroke. Overnight, the power dynamic flipped. The HOA board, once drunk on control, was now powerless. They had to come to James, hat in hand, for permission on the very thing they thought they owned. James didn't use his newfound leverage to make anyone's life harder. He wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he used it to restore balance. He lowered the fees to a fair maintenance contribution, enough to keep the road and gate in good condition, nothing more. He made it clear that no one's freedom of movement would ever be threatened again. The neighborhood relaxed. The cattle rancher who had been treated like a prisoner was now the quiet guardian of the community's only way out. And the HOA? They learned a lesson the hard way, that greed and arrogance can blind you. And when you try to fence someone in, you might just end up fencing yourself out. James returned to his porch in the evenings, coffee in hand, the horizon wide and open once more. The fence was still there, but it no longer bothered him. It was no longer a cage. It was a reminder of the battle he'd fought and the freedom he'd reclaimed, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. In the end, James didn't just win. He outsmarted them, and his story became a quiet legend in town. The tale of the rancher who turned the tables on the HOA, proving once and for all that patience, persistence, and a little bit of cleverness can outmatch even the most powerful of bullies. The next HOA meeting was unforgettable. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood. People whispered in their driveways, texted in hushed tones, and traded rumors over backyard fences. Everyone knew James had something planned, but no one was quite sure what. Some thought he was bluffing. Others believed he had finally given in. But when James walked into that meeting, calm as ever, all eyes turned to him. The HOA board sat at the front table, stiff-backed and smug. They had grown used to controlling the conversation, dictating rules, and making homeowners bend to their will. One board member cleared his throat and began. "Mr. James, we understand you've been reluctant to comply with community regulations. However, if you wish to continue accessing the neighborhood gate, you'll be required to pay the standard access fees." James didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he slowly opened a leather folder he had brought with him and slid a single document across the table. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost too quiet for the tension in the room. "This strip of land," James said evenly, tapping the paper with his finger, "including the gate you built on it? I own it now." At first, the board members chuckled. They exchanged amused glances, as if humoring a child. One even muttered, "That's impossible." But then, curiosity got the better of them. They leaned in, eyes scanning the page. Their smiles faded. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a bluff. There, in black ink, was the official property deed, stamped, signed, and notarized. The land under the gate, the access point for the entire community, was no longer leased by the HOA. It belonged solely to James. The room went silent. For years, the HOA had thrived on intimidation. But in that moment, with a single sheet of paper, James had stripped them of their authority. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, trying to hide their smirks. A few even let out quiet chuckles. For once, the bullies were on the receiving end. James leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his expression steady. Then he added, almost casually, "So, if you'd like to get through this gate, you'll need my permission." It was like watching a storm hit the boardroom. One board member's face flushed red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Another stammered, That's not how this works." But their protests rang hollow. Everyone in that room knew the truth. The HOA had built its entire scheme on land it didn't even own. And now, the man they tried to fence and held the only key to their freedom. Neighbors began whispering among themselves. Some gasped in disbelief. Others grinned openly, thrilled to see justice served. For months, people had watched the board push James around, certain he'd eventually give in. But now, here he was standing taller than ever, not just free, but in complete control. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same people who once trapped him now needed him. The same gate that symbolized his cage was now theirs. James didn't gloat. He wasn't the type. Instead, he sat quietly and let the weight of his words hang in the air. The board fumbled for a response, but nothing they said could undo the reality staring them in the face. Their plan hadn't just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. Finally, one of the braver neighbors spoke up from the back of the room. "So, James, what happens now?" James looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had avoided him for months. Some had sided with the board, others had stayed silent out of fear, but now every single one of them was waiting on his answer. "I'm not here to punish anyone," James said firmly. "I'm not shutting the gate, and I'm not charging ridiculous fees. But things will change. From now on, no one gets to use rules to bully their neighbors. No more cages. No more nonsense." The words landed like a hammer. The board had lost its grip, and everyone knew it. The homeowners who once felt powerless suddenly realized they didn't have to live under constant fear of fines and threats. James had broken the cycle. As the meeting ended, neighbors came up to him one by one. Some shook his hand. Others whispered thank yous, relief in their eyes. A few even admitted they wished they'd stood by him sooner. James nodded politely, but didn't rub it in. He wasn't looking for praise. He had only ever wanted his freedom back, and now he had it. Walking out of that meeting, James felt the cool night air hit his face. He looked back once, watching the board members huddled together, their power crumbling like sand through their fingers. The fence they had built to control him was now nothing more than a monument to their failure. And James? He was no longer the man trapped behind their gate. He was the man who owned it. From that day forward, the story of James spread across town. People who had once whispered about him now spoke his name with respect. The man who had been boxed in, caged by his own community, had flipped the tables in a way no one could have predicted. He became a quiet legend, not because he fought with fists or anger, but because he outsmarted those who tried to control him. The rancher who once looked like a victim had become the man who held the keys, literally, to everyone's freedom. But here's the thing, James didn't gloat. He didn't wave his new ownership around like a weapon. He didn't use it to punish the people who had turned their backs on him when the HOA was at its most powerful. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he did something remarkable, something that set him apart as a true leader. He set fair rules, simple, clear, and just. The gate remained open for all, but no one would ever again be threatened with cages or manipulated with made-up fees. The maintenance costs for the road and gate were real, yes, but James set them at a fair level, nothing like the outrageous amounts the HOA had demanded. And he made sure every dollar went exactly where it was supposed to: upkeep, safety, and repairs. In short, he gave the community what the HOA had promised but failed to deliver: honesty and fairness. Neighbors noticed the change. People who once avoided him now greeted him warmly. They realized that James hadn't just fought for himself. By standing up, by refusing to be bullied, he had quietly fought for everyone else too. He had proven that when one person refuses to bend, it can shift the balance for an entire community. His ranch was free again. The driveway that had once felt like a choke point was wide open, just as it had been meant to be. His cattle roamed without worry, and James returned to his quiet life. Coffee on the porch, boots in the dirt, and sunsets stretching across the horizon. And the HOA? They learned the hard way that greed and control don't always win. Their fence, once a symbol of their power, now stood as a reminder of their failure. The board members who had once spoken with such authority were reduced to silence, forced to follow the rules of the man they had tried to trap. Their arrogance had backfired so completely that people around town began using the story as a warning. Never underestimate the quiet ones, because patience and persistence can outlast even the strongest wall. James had turned the tables in the smartest way possible. He hadn't fought them with their own weapons, endless fines, threats, and intimidation. He had fought them with intelligence, patience, and the law. And he won. The HOA tried to fence him in, but he ended up owning their only way out. And that, perhaps, is what made his victory so powerful. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about crushing his enemies. It was about restoring freedom, the very thing they had tried to steal from him. The story spread beyond the town, reaching people who had their own battles with HOAs, bullies, or unfair systems. To many, James became a symbol of resistance. Proof that even when the odds are stacked against you, there's always a way forward if you refuse to give up. And so now, I'll leave you with this. What do you think? Was James right to flip the script on the HOA? Should he have played it differently? Maybe forgiven and forgotten? Or was his quiet, clever victory the perfect way to teach them a lesson? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what side you're on. Because this story isn't just about one rancher. It's about standing up for your rights when no one else will. It's about reminding bullies that power isn't permanent, and that sometimes the people they least expect are the ones who rise up and change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who could use a little inspiration, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories. Because at the end of the day, stories like this remind us of something important. Freedom isn't just about land or gates or fences. It's about refusing to let anyone take from you what you've worked hard to build. It's about resilience, courage, and the quiet strength to stand your ground, even when the world is pushing against you. And James, the rancher who turned his cage into a doorway, is living proof of that.